Can one moment of mercy change the course of history? Stay with us through this incredible four-part journey as we witness how a cup of water in the desert becomes the bridge between two enemies, ultimately transforming hatred into hope. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. This story will leave you speechless. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, its rays shimmering like liquid fire across the endless expanse of desert. Samuel McKenna pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face, squinting against the glare, as his horse picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain. The year was 1883, and the frontier was still a place where survival depended on strength, cunning, and an unwavering resolve to protect what was yours. Sam had been tracking the small band of Apache raiders for 3 days now, following their trail across the unforgiving landscape. His weathered hands gripped the reins tightly, knuckles white with determination. These weren't just any raiders. This was the same group that had swept down from the mountains 6 months ago, burning his homestead and taking everything that mattered to him. His wife, Sarah, and their young son, Tommy, had been tending the garden when the attack came. By the time Sam returned from the cattle drive, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins and 2 wooden crosses he'd carved with trembling hands. The trail led through a narrow canyon where the walls rose like ancient sentinels on either side. Red sandstone stretched toward the cloudless sky, carved by centuries of wind and rain into fantastic shapes that seemed to watch his every move. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft clip-clop of his horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. As Sam emerged from the canyon's mouth, something caught his eye, a dark shape lying motionless in a small clearing ahead. His horse snorted nervously, sensing the tension in its rider as Sam slowly approached. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, sprawled in the dust with his arms spread wide, lay an Apache warrior. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and dark blood had pooled beneath him, staining the pale sand crimson. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and his traditional clothing was torn and bloodied from what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds. Sam dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. As he drew closer, recognition hit him like a physical blow. Even through the pain and blood, he knew that face. This was Nalnish, the Apache war leader who had led the raid on his ranch, the man who had murdered his family. The warrior's eyes fluttered open, dark and pain-filled, focusing with difficulty on Sam's face. There was no fear there, only a quiet dignity even in defeat. Nalnish's lips moved, but no sound came out. His breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment. Sam stood over his enemy, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and something else he couldn't quite identify. Here was the man who had destroyed his life, lying helpless before him. Justice seemed within reach. All he had to do was walk away and let the desert claim its due. The vultures circling overhead would do the rest. But as he stared down at the dying warrior, memories flooded back, not just of that terrible day, but of earlier times. He remembered the trading posts where Apache and white settlers had once conducted business peacefully. He recalled stories his wife Sarah used to tell about the native families she'd encountered. Stories of children who played and laughed just like any others, of mothers who worried about their sons going to war. Nalnish coughed, specks of blood appearing on his lips. The sound snapped Sam back to the present moment. The man was dying, that much was clear. Multiple wounds, loss of blood, and the brutal desert heat were taking their toll. He probably had minutes, maybe an hour if he was lucky. Sam's hand moved away from his gun, and instead reached for the water canteen hanging from his saddle. The metal was warm to the touch, heated by the relentless sun. He knelt beside the Apache warrior, careful to stay out of arm's reach, despite the man's obvious weakness. "Water," Sam said simply, his voice hoarse from the dry air. Nalnish's eyes focused on him with difficulty, perhaps surprised to hear English spoken gently rather than shouted in anger. The warrior tried to lift his head but couldn't manage it. Sam moved closer, supporting the man's head with one hand while bringing the canteen to his lips with the other. The first few drops of water seemed to revive Nalnish slightly. He drank slowly, carefully, his throat working to swallow. Some of the water ran down his chin, mixing with the dust and blood, but his eyes showed gratitude, a universal expression that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Why? Nalnish whispered in heavily accented English, his voice barely audible. Sam paused, the canteen still in his hands. Why indeed? He could have listed a dozen reasons to let this man die. Revenge for his family, justice for countless raids, protection for other settlers who might fall victim to future attacks. Instead, he found himself thinking of Sarah's gentle voice, of the way she used to talk about treating all people with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. "Because you're dying," Sam replied simply, "and no man should die of thirst." The Apache warrior studied Sam's face for a long moment, something shifting in his dark eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find in his enemy. He drank again, more deeply this time, and some color seemed to return to his ashen features. As Nalnish drank, Sam noticed details he hadn't seen before. The warrior wore a small leather pouch around his neck, and peeking out from it was what appeared to be a child's drawing, crude stick figures that could have been made by any 6-year-old. On his wrist was a bracelet of woven grass, the kind made by patient fingers during long winter evenings. This wasn't just a warrior, Sam realized. This was a father, a husband, a man with a family who would mourn his passing, just as Sam mourned his own losses. The recognition hit him like a punch to the gut, complicated and unwelcome but undeniably true. The sun continued its relentless assault as Sam knelt in the dust beside his dying enemy, offering water and shade where he could. He didn't know what else to do, but something deep inside told him this was right. This small act of mercy in a world that had shown precious little of it to either of them. As the shadows began to lengthen and the first hints of evening approached, Sam remained by Nalnish's side, two warriors bound together by violence and loss, sharing water and silence under the vast Arizona sky. The desert wind picked up as evening approached, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a cool night. Sam had fashioned a makeshift shelter using his saddle blanket, creating shade for the wounded Apache warrior. Nalnish drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. Each time he woke, Sam was there with water and a damp cloth to cool his fevered brow. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Nalnish's eyes opened with more clarity than before. He studied Sam's face in the golden light, as if trying to reconcile the enemy he'd expected with the man who now sat beside him. "You know who I am," Nalnish said, his voice stronger now but still strained. Sam nodded slowly. "I know. You're the one who led the raid on my ranch. You killed my wife and son." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with pain and accusation. Nalnish closed his eyes, and for a moment Sam thought he'd lost consciousness again. But then the warrior spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The woman. She had yellow hair. Like corn silk." Sam's jaw tightened. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah. She tried to protect the boy, stood in front of him with her arms spread wide." Nalnish's eyes opened, meeting Sam's. "I remember her face. She was not afraid, only sad." The image hit Sam like a physical blow. He could see it all too clearly, his gentle wife faced with death, thinking not of herself but of their child. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment the old rage threatened to consume him. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam asked, his voice tight with control. Nalnish coughed, wincing at the pain. "Because you gave me water, because—" He struggled to find the English words. "Because I want you to know she died with honor, like a warrior." Tears Sam hadn't allowed himself to shed for months suddenly burned at the corners of his eyes. He turned away, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in his heart. "My son," Nalnish continued, his voice growing weaker again. "He has 8 summers. His mother worries when I am away too long on the war trail." Sam looked back at the dying man. "What's his name?" "Bidzil. It means he is strong." A ghost of a smile crossed Nalnish's lips. "He asks many questions. Always why, like all children." "Tommy was the same way," Sam found himself saying. "Drove Sarah half crazy with his questions. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Why do cows moo? Why can't I ride the wild horses?" His voice broke slightly on the last words. The two men fell into silence, each lost in memories of the children they'd loved and lost, or feared losing. The desert around them was cooling rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "The raid on your ranch," Nalnish said suddenly. It was not meant to happen that way." Sam's attention snapped back to the present. "What do you mean?" Nalnish struggled to prop himself up on one elbow, his face contorting with pain. "We came for horses, cattle. Your family was supposed to be gone. The scouts said you had all gone to town for supplies." "The wagon broke down," Sam said quietly. "A wheel came loose just outside town. Sarah and Tommy came back while I stayed to fix it. If they had not been there..." Nalnish's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. "But they were there," Sam said, his voice hard again, "and you killed them anyway." "My warriors, they were young, hot-blooded. When they saw your woman and boy, they saw the faces of their own families, killed by soldiers at the reservation. They saw the children who died from the white man's diseases, the women who starved when the promised food never came." Nalnish's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It does not make it right, but it explains why." Sam felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of hatred he'd carried for so long. He didn't forgive, wasn't sure he ever could, but for the first time, he began to understand. The cycle of violence that had claimed his family was part of something larger, something that had been building for generations. "Your English is very good," Sam observed, changing the subject. "Missionary school, when I was young, before the war started again." Nalnish managed a weak smile. "I learned to read your Bible, strange book, full of contradictions. Such as, your Jesus, he tells his followers to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies. But your soldiers, they carry Bibles in one hand and guns in the other." Sam considered this. "I reckon most of us aren't very good at following what we claim to believe. Apache way is simpler, eye for eye, blood for blood. But..." Nalnish gestured weakly at the water canteen beside him. "This is not Apache way or white man's way. This is something else." As full darkness settled over the desert, Sam built a small fire to keep them warm. The flames danced and flickered, casting strange shadows on the surrounding rocks. He shared his meager supplies, jerky, hardtack, and coffee, with the wounded warrior who ate slowly but gratefully. "You have children?" Nalnish asked as they sat by the fire. "Just Tommy. Sarah. She had troubles with childbirth. The doctor said there wouldn't be any more." Sam poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. "We were talking about adopting one of the orphans from town. There are always children who need homes out here. The Apache take in children who have no parents. They become sons and daughters as if born to the tribe. Sounds like we're not so different after all," Sam mused. Nalnish was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "My grandfather, he used to say that all men are brothers under the same sky. I thought he was foolish, weak. But tonight, sharing fire with my enemy..." He looked at Sam. "Perhaps the old man was wiser than I knew." The night wore on, and Sam found himself really talking for the first time since the massacre. He told Nalnish about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west with dreams of making a life on the frontier. He spoke of Sarah's kindness, of Tommy's laughter, of the simple pleasures they'd found in their isolated ranch house. In return, Nalnish shared stories of his own childhood, of learning to hunt and track from his father, of the old ways that were disappearing as the white settlements expanded. He spoke of his wife's gentle hands and his son's stubborn curiosity, of the burden of leadership that weighed heavily on his shoulders. As dawn approached, bringing with it the harsh reality of what lay ahead, both men fell silent. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the desert air was crisp and clean. Nalnish's breathing had become more labored again, and Sam knew the end was near. "When I die," Nalnish whispered, "will you see that my family knows what became of me?" Sam nodded, not trusting his voice. "And tell them that I met a white man who showed mercy to his enemy. Tell them that perhaps there is hope for peace between our peoples." The first rays of sunlight were painting the eastern mountains gold when Nalnish closed his eyes for the final time. Sam sat with him until the end, holding the warrior's hand as he passed from this world to whatever lay beyond. As he prepared to bury his former enemy in the desert sand, Sam had no idea that everything was about to change. that his simple act of compassion would set in motion events that would reshape the entire territory. 3 days had passed since Sam buried Nalnish beneath a cairn of desert stones, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross alongside a traditional Apache prayer stick he'd fashioned from memory of the warrior's descriptions. The image of his enemy's peaceful face in death haunted him as he rode slowly back toward civilization, unsure of what he would find when he returned to the world of men. The town of Copper Creek sat baking in the afternoon sun like a collection of wooden boxes scattered across the desert floor. Its single main street was lined with the usual frontier establishments: a saloon, general store, blacksmith shop, and the modest church where Pastor Williams held services every Sunday. As Sam's horse plodded wearily down the dusty street, he noticed an unusual number of people gathered in small groups, their conversations animated and urgent. Martha Henderson, the postmaster's wife, was the first to spot him. She hurried across the street, her calico dress kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. "Sam McKenna, thank the Lord you're safe," she called out, genuine relief in her voice. "We heard there was Apache trouble out your way. Sheriff's been organizing search parties." Sam dismounted slowly, his joints stiff from days in the saddle. "No trouble, Martha. Just been doing some thinking." Before Martha could respond, Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the saloon, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. The star on his vest caught the sunlight as he approached, and Sam could see the worry lines that seemed deeper than before. "Sam, good to see you in one piece," Bradley said, clasping his shoulder. "We need to talk. There's been developments." They walked toward the sheriff's office past groups of townspeople who nodded respectfully to Sam but continued their urgent conversations. Inside the small building, Bradley poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing on the wood stove. "Apache raiding party hit the Johnson spread yesterday morning," Bradley began without preamble. "Killed 2 ranch hands, ran off with about 30 head of cattle. But here's the strange part. They left the family untouched, even left medicine for Mrs. Johnson's sick baby." Sam frowned, accepting the coffee cup. "That doesn't sound like a typical raid. Get stranger. This morning, old Pete Millerson was riding fence when he came across an Apache warrior sitting his horse right out in the open, maybe 50 yards away. Pete went for his rifle, but the Indian just sat there, didn't move, didn't threaten, just watched. What happened? Pete said the warrior threw something toward him, then rode off. Turned out to be a small leather pouch with some kind of message inside." Bradley opened his desk drawer and pulled out a piece of bark with symbols carved into its surface. "Doc Patterson thinks it's some kind of Apache writing, but none of us can read it." Sam studied the symbols, remembering Nalnish's stories about the old ways of communication. Something stirred in his memory, a conversation by the campfire about how messages were sometimes sent between tribes. "Sheriff, I need to tell you something about where I've been these past few days." For the next hour, Sam recounted his encounter with Nalnish, leaving nothing out. He told of finding his family's killer dying in the desert, of the water he'd shared, of the long night of conversation that had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the conflict that plagued the territory. Bradley listened in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. When Sam finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "Sam, you realize what you're telling me? You gave aid and comfort to the enemy. Some folks around here might call that treason. And what would you call it, Tom?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the bustling street. "I'd call it complicated. But that's not the end of it. There's been Apache activity all around the territory. Not raids exactly, but sightings. Groups of warriors moving toward the mountains like they're gathering for something big." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "What kind of gathering?" "That's what's got everyone spooked. Could be a war council. Could be they're planning something major. The Army's already moving troops up from Fort Carson, and there's talk of calling in the cavalry from New Mexico." Through the window, Sam could see more people arriving in town, ranchers from the outlying areas, their wagons loaded with families and possessions. The signs of impending conflict were everywhere. "There's something else," Bradley continued. "Word came in this morning that Nalnish's body was found buried out in the desert. Proper burial from what the scouts could tell. The Apache who found him seemed to think it was done by someone who understood their customs." Sam's heart began to race. What does that mean? It means they know someone showed respect to their war leader, someone who took the time to honor him in death instead of leaving him for the buzzards. Bradley fixed Sam with a steady stare. The question is, what are they planning to do about it? Before Sam could respond, the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats filled the air. Through the window, they could see a young cavalry officer dismounting from a lathered horse, his uniform dusty from hard riding. Lieutenant James Morrison burst through the office door, his face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff Bradley, I've got orders from Colonel Matthews at Fort Carson. We need to evacuate all civilians from the outlying ranches immediately." "What's the situation, Lieutenant?" Bradley asked, rising from his chair. "Apache forces are massing in the Dragoon Mountains. Our scouts estimate at least 200 warriors, maybe more. They're being led by someone the Apache call Nalnish's successor, seems to be his younger brother or something. Intelligence suggests they're planning a major offensive." Sam felt the world tilt around him. "When?" "Could be any time. Tomorrow, next week, we don't know. But the colonel wants all non-combatants moved to the safety of the larger towns. We're setting up defensive positions here and at Tombstone." As the lieutenant continued briefing the sheriff on military preparations, Sam stepped outside into the gathering dusk. The town was transforming before his eyes into an armed camp. Men were cleaning rifles and checking ammunition while women packed emergency supplies. Children sensed the tension and stayed close to their parents, their usual playful chatter replaced by wide-eyed silence. Dr. Patterson approached from across the street, the Apache message bark in his hands. "Sam, I heard you were back. Martha said you might be able to help with this." He held up the carved symbols. "Nobody in town can make heads or tails of it." Sam took the bark, studying the symbols in the fading light. Slowly the meaning began to emerge, not from any deep knowledge of Apache writing, but from something Nalnish had shown him during their long night together. The warrior had traced similar symbols in the sand while talking about honor and respect. "It's not a threat," Sam said quietly. It's an invitation." "An invitation to what?" Sam looked around at the frightened faces of his neighbors, at the preparations for war that were transforming his peaceful town into a fortress. He thought of Nalnish's final words about hope for peace between their peoples, and of the warrior's young son, who would now grow up without a father. "A chance to talk," he said finally. "They want to parley." Dr. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "How can you be sure?" "Because I'm the one they want to talk to." As if summoned by his words, a new sound reached their ears from the desert beyond town, the rhythmic beating of drums carried on the evening wind. The Apache were coming, and Sam McKenna, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to his dying enemy, stood at the center of a gathering storm that would determine the fate of everyone in the territory. The drums grew louder as darkness fell, and Sam knew that tomorrow would bring either the bloodiest conflict the territory had ever seen, or something that no one, Apache or white, had dared to imagine possible. Dawn broke over Copper Creek with an eerie silence that seemed to press down on the town like a physical weight. The Apache drums had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind a stillness that felt more ominous than the rhythmic beating had been. Sam stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, his rifle in hand but pointing toward the ground, watching the eastern horizon where the first rays of sunlight painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The town behind him was awake but quiet. Families huddled in their homes, windows shuttered and doors barred. The few men who moved through the streets did so with weapons ready, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding hills for signs of movement. Lieutenant Morrison had positioned his soldiers at strategic points throughout the town, creating overlapping fields of fire that could, theoretically, hold off a substantial attack. But Sam knew this wasn't going to be that kind of fight. Sheriff Bradley emerged from the office, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "Any sign of them?" "Not yet." Sam accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth seeping through the tin cup into his cold hands. "But they're out there, waiting. For what?" "For me to make the first move." As if in response to his words, a single figure appeared on the ridgeline to the east. Even at that distance, Sam could make out the distinctive silhouette of an Apache warrior on horseback, sitting motionless against the brightening sky. As they watched, more figures appeared, first a few, then dozens, until the entire ridge was lined with mounted warriors. "Jesus," Bradley whispered, "there must be 300 of them." Lieutenant Morrison came running from his position near the church, his face pale beneath his military bearing. "Sheriff, we need to get the civilians into the church basement now. My men can hold the perimeter, but—" "Wait," Sam interrupted, his voice calm despite the hammering of his heart. "Look at them. Really look." The lieutenant raised his field glasses, studying the line of warriors on the ridge. After a moment, his expression changed from fear to confusion. "They're not in attack formation. They're just sitting there. Because they're waiting for an invitation," Sam said. He handed his rifle to Sheriff Bradley and began walking toward his horse. "Sam, what the hell are you doing?" Bradley grabbed his arm. "What I should have done 3 days ago when I found Nalnish dying in the desert." Sam gently pulled free from the sheriff's grip. "I'm going to finish what we started. That's suicide and you know it." Sam swung up into his saddle, his movements calm and deliberate. "Maybe. But it's the only chance we have to stop this from becoming a massacre on both sides." He rode slowly down the main street, past the frightened faces peering through shuttered windows, past the soldiers crouched behind makeshift barricades, past the church where Pastor Williams was leading the townspeople in prayer. As he reached the edge of town, he could hear Lieutenant Morrison shouting orders to his men, preparing for the worst. The ride across the open desert toward the ridge took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. With each step his horse took toward the waiting Apache warriors, Sam felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Every raid, every retaliation, every act of violence between their peoples seemed to converge on this single moment. As he drew closer, he could make out individual faces among the warriors. They were younger than he'd expected. Many seemed barely out of their teens. But their eyes held the hardness of men who had seen too much death, who had lost too much to ever fully trust again. At the center of the line sat a warrior who bore a striking resemblance to Nalnish. This had to be the younger brother the soldiers had mentioned, the man who now led the Apache forces. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the same proud bearing and intelligent eyes that Sam remembered from his dying enemy. Sam stopped his horse 20 yards from the line of warriors and dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and empty. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the potential for violence or something else entirely. The young war leader urged his horse forward, stopping just a few feet from where Sam stood. When he spoke, his English was even better than his brother's had been. "You are the one who gave water to Nalnish in his dying hour." It wasn't a question. Sam nodded. "I am. I am Key, his brother. I have come to understand why." Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your brother was a good man, a warrior, but also a father who loved his son. You could have let him die in agony. You could have taken his scalp and ridden back to your people as a hero." Key's voice was level, showing no emotion. "Instead, you stayed with him. You honored him in death. Why?" The question hung in the desert air, and Sam found himself thinking not just of Nalnish, but of Sarah and Tommy, of all the lives that had been lost in this endless cycle of revenge. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "Because mercy is stronger than vengeance. Because someone has to be the first to choose differently." Key studied him for a long moment, then dismounted from his own horse. He walked forward until he stood directly in front of Sam, close enough that they could see the pain and hope warring in each other's eyes. "My brother spoke to our people of you before he died. The scouts who found his grave saw how you had honored our customs, how you had treated him as a warrior rather than an enemy. This is not something we have seen from the white man before." "It's not something I'd done before either," Sam admitted. "But your brother taught me something in those last hours. He helped me see that our children, all our children, deserve better than this endless war." From behind Key, another warrior rode forward. Sam recognized him immediately. It was the young brave who had been with Nalnish during the raid on his ranch, the one whose face had haunted his nightmares for months. The warrior's eyes were filled with shame as he looked at Sam. "This is Hastian," Key said quietly. "He was among those who killed your family. He has carried the weight of that act every day since." Sam looked at the young warrior, seeing not the savage of his nightmares, but a boy barely old enough to be a man, crushed by the consequences of choices made in anger and fear. For a moment, the old rage threatened to surface, but then he heard Sarah's voice in his memory, talking about forgiveness and the power of mercy. "We all carry weights," Sam said finally. The question is whether we'll let them crush us or teach us to be better. Hastin slipped from his horse and approached slowly, his head bowed. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I have no words for what I took from you, but I would give my life to undo it. Sam stared at the young man for a long moment, feeling the eyes of hundreds of warriors upon them. In the distance, he could see the soldiers of Copper Creek watching through field glasses, ready to charge to his rescue at the first sign of violence. Instead, Sam reached out and placed his hand on Hastin's shoulder. Then live. Live and make sure no other children die the way mine did. The gesture rippled through the assembled warriors like a stone thrown into still water. Many lowered their weapons, and Sam could see something shifting in their faces. Not defeat, but a kind of wondering hope that perhaps there might be another way forward. Key stepped forward again, his voice carrying across the desert. My brother believed that you might be the bridge between our peoples, a man who could show mercy to his enemy, who could honor the dead while still fighting for the living. He paused, looking back at his warriors, then at the distant town. Perhaps it is time to test that belief. What happened next would be talked about for generations. Key raised his voice so that it carried to both his warriors and the soldiers watching from town. Let it be known that Nalnish's debt has been paid. The man who showed mercy to our war leader in his final hour has shown us a path we had not seen. If Sam McKenna will speak for his people as I speak for mine, let us try to walk this path together. The sun was fully up now, bathing the desert in brilliant light as two former enemies stood face to face, surrounded by the instruments of war but choosing the harder path of peace. Behind them, their peoples watched and waited, ready to follow them into an uncertain but hopeful future. As Sam clasped Key's outstretched hand, he thought of Nalnish's final words about hope for peace between their peoples. The Apache warrior had been right. Sometimes a single act of mercy, offered at the darkest moment, could change everything. The desert wind carried their words back to Copper Creek, where children would grow up in a world where mercy had proven stronger than vengeance, and where the legacy of one cup of water shared between enemies had become the foundation for a lasting peace. In the years that followed, the story would be told and retold, growing with each telling but never losing its essential truth, that in a harsh land where survival often demanded hardness, one man's choice to show compassion to his dying enemy had transformed not just their own lives, but the destiny of everyone around them. The legend of Sam McKenna and the Apache warrior became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the darkest moments, mercy and justice could walk hand in hand toward a better tomorrow.